Well, here we are in session 88, entitled Back to Pilate, from Herod, of course. We're going to be looking at Mark 15, verses 6 through 14, Luke more in chapter 3, John more in chapter 18, and we'll probably pick up a bit of Matthew as we come back to Pilate from Herod. Well, a couple questions again to think about as we start, and maybe we'll get answered during our session today. What was Pilate then to do, since Herod evidently found nothing with which to charge Jesus, at least nothing that's going to get him executed? What choices did Pilate have? What were the possible consequences of each of his actions? Could he find Jesus guilty of something? If so, what was the penalty going to be? What would he have to do if they found that Jesus could not be found guilty? Well, that last one we know is not going to hold up. They will find something to accuse Jesus of in order to get rid of him. Pilate will do it simply to get rid of the Jewish problem. The Jews themselves were pushing for that. They will insist that Pilate do this so that they could get rid of their Jesus problem. So Pilate has a Jew problem. The Jews have a Jesus problem. Did Pilate think that he could persuade the people, the Jews, and override the influence of the religious leaders present? Remember, in all of this, the people leading the charge are the chief priests. Remember, one from each tribe and so forth. We've been through that before. So, is Pilate going to be able to do the right thing, or are the Jewish chief priests going to be able to keep people riled up enough so that he cannot ignore them? This session was driven by a tradition of Roman clemency. Yeah, got that one spelled out. Roman clemency in connection with Passover. Remember, the one deal that Rome seemed willing to do at Passover is to appease the Jewish group and release a prisoner. So, keep that in mind, because that's going to be, in the end, that's the driving attempt that Pilate will use. So, we're going to go then and begin with 3 verses that are unique to Luke, who seems bent on emphasizing Jesus' innocence and the chief priest's guilt and dishonesty. So he's trying to paint a contrast for us. Pilate had just come out of the palace to the crowd and made another, as a matter of fact, this is the 3rd time that Pilate has made a declaration of Jesus' innocence. He doesn't say that. He just said, I can't find anything to charge him with. He doesn't say he's innocent. That would cause him another problem. By the way, some of the translations do use the word innocent, but I don't think that's really what Pilate was doing. He was trying to avoid the word innocent for his own purposes. So, let's go to Luke 23, verses, and I said 3 verses, but actually going to look at 4, it looks like, 13 through 16. Luke 23, verses 13, 14, 15 and 16. Then Pilate called together the chief priests. So now Pilate has called this group together. Evidently they had dispersed. Remember, the chief priests followed Jesus to Herod, so he's called them back now again. The priests, chief priests, the rulers, I don't know if that means elders here specifically, and the people. So he was not going strictly with the religious people. He was calling the people. And interestingly, something in that term, the people, makes you believe that there were some possibly Jesus supporters in this group. Luke has never used this term to mean an offensive mob. So there were three sets: priests, rulers, people. Verse 14, and Pilate then said to them, "You brought me this man," Jesus, of course, "as one who was misleading the people." They said he was stirring them up. And Pilate is now saying, when I examined him in front of you, before you, I did not find this man guilty of anything you accused him of doing. He said, I can't find a charge because whatever you told me he was doing, I can't find that he's guilty. Verse 15, neither did Herod, for he sent Jesus back to us. Look, Jesus, has done nothing deserving of death. That's about as straightforward as Pilate could possibly say it. And in verse 16, I will therefore, and now he's trying to appease the Jews, I will therefore have him flogged, and this term for flogged means lightly flogged, and release him. So he said, I'll punish him a bit, but then I'll release him. Again, many Lucan scholars point to the Greek word for the people as indicating not a general Jewish group, but that group who were either in favor of Jesus or neutral with respect to him. They were not a mob of anti-Jesus characters. At least that one section, the people, were not. So what does it mean? Well, I don't know, really. I suppose that the mob called together by Pilate was not a rabid, blood-hungry group that we might have thought. Just saying. Maybe not. Herod's returning Jesus to Pilate essentially meant that Jesus had done nothing in Herod's jurisdiction, which means what? Either Galilee or Perea. He wouldn't have done anything warranting imprison or death. Herod didn't come up with a thing, except that he didn't like how Jesus refused to talk with him. So he abused Jesus, at least verbally, and mocking him. But what did Pilate do? Well, Pilate seemingly attempted to placate the Jews by lightly flogging Jesus before releasing him. It definitely appears as though Pilate wanted to be as fair to Jesus as he could without causing any kind of ongoing Jewish disturbance. Yeah, finally got stumbled up there, right? The New American Standard has no verse 17, by the way, so we're going to skip it too. And the verse 17 was just simply implying that Pilate was obliged to release someone at Passover. But most of the better Greek manuscripts don't include that passage, so most translations don't include it either, as does the NAS not include it. John, however, did add something a little bit extra here, and I'm reading from John 18:39. And this is Pilate speaking again to the people. But you have a custom, not me, you have a custom, that I should release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews? Who, of course, is Jesus. So John's placement of this is interesting. John puts this immediately after Pilate's little pithy statement, what is truth, when he's responding to Jesus. And this was before Jesus was shipped to Herod, apparently. But you have to remember also that John has Pilate offering to release the innocent Jesus without a single reference to Barabbas. But recall now that John skips over Jesus' appearance in front of Herod to the point that we're examining today. So what has John done? He's taken the first thing with Pilate. He's taken the second group with Pilate. He's skipping over Herod and bringing these two sections together. So that's why it appears maybe out of sequence a bit. But it probably isn't because of his telescoping of these two sections together. But again, John skips over Herod and he jumps immediately from leaving Jesus into the section that we're looking at today. So like Mark, John doesn't give us everything either. Mark gives us even less detail, at least. But rather than a contradiction, John is apparently showing a different perspective, while, as I said, telescoping two events together, omitting the trial before Herod. So that's why it looks a little bit out of order. But let's take a look at Pilate's other message that Mark omits, and that's in Matthew 27, verse 19. And this is a message that came to Pilate. As he, Pilate, was sitting on the judgment seat, evidently some ritual seat that the Romans used when sentencing people, his wife, Pilate's wife, sent a message to him, saying this, have nothing to do with that innocent man. I have suffered greatly as a result of a dream about him today. So John didn't tell us that either. Neither did Mark, neither did Luke, as I recall. The synoptic writers evidently wish to inform their audience, who might not know of the Roman tradition of Passover, of releasing a prisoner, just about what was to happen, to be the offer that Pilate was going to make, and the response of the Jews. That's what's coming up next. Excuse me. I think I need a sip of coffee. Just one second. That helps a bit, I think. Matthew 27:15. During the feast, that's of Passover, of course, and unleavened bread, the governor was accustomed to, not that he had to, but he was accustomed to. And you know, if you get accustomed to a certain thing happen, you expect it to happen again. So that's why some probably talked about obliged to do this. What was he accustomed to doing? To release the governor, to release one prisoner to the crowd, whoever they wanted. They got to pick. At that time, they had in custody, the Romans did, the notorious prisoner named, and catch this, Jesus Barabbas. It's an interesting name. Jesus, of course, is a match for the one Pilate's trying to protect. But Barabbas, think about it. Bar means son of. Abbas means daddy. Son of daddy. Jesus, son of daddy. So here we have the one Pilate's trying to protect, Jesus, son of God. And here we have a notorious guy, abandoned evidently, we'll see that in a second, called Jesus, son of daddy. So we got Jesus, son of God, in prison, along with Jesus, son of daddy, and he said, okay, who do you want me to release to you, son of God or son of daddy? Well, let's look at Luke 23:19. This Barabbas was a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection. Here's a guy who was actually guilty of what they're trying to charge Jesus with, the other Jesus. And he started in the city. He started this insurrection in the city. And he's also in there because somebody got killed during the process. He was wanting to be tried for murder besides insurrection. And either of those would get a guilty plea out of Pilate and would get him, Jesus Barabbas, on the cross. Now, but Jesus Barabbas, we know, is not going to the cross. He's going to be going free, while Jesus, son of God, is going to the cross. So we got Jesus, son of the cross, going where Jesus, son of daddy, should be going. Does that sound anything like the salvation message of Jesus being the substitute for the sinner? Jesus, the substitute for Jesus, the son of daddy? I'm just asking. Mark 15:8. Then the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to release a prisoner for them, as was his custom. So Mark says it that way, but he says that this began with the crowd asking for the release of someone. John sort of implied that that might be the case. Mark gets a little bit stronger in it. Matthew intimated that Pilate himself had done this on previous Passovers, although he didn't say Pilate, right? He said the governor. So we'd have to know whether Pilate was a governor on previous Passovers. This one was causing him a lot of heartburn, though. Now, Barabbas, son of daddy, was due to die by crucifixion. One might even look again, as I mentioned a moment ago, at Jesus' crucifixion to mean Jesus died for and in the place of Barabbas. So if you think that's a miscarriage of justice, put your own name in place of Barabbas. Think about it. But also think about this. Many in Israel would have hailed Barabbas as a hero, right? He was an independence fighter, a guerrilla fighter in the resistance against Rome. So he might have been felt justified, probably himself felt justified, but the people probably felt he was justified in do that. I'm thinking back to a term that came up when Jerusalem and Israel was about to get their land back in 1948. There were guerrilla fighters among the Jews, I think they were called the Haggadah, who were blowing up bridges, blowing up Hotel of David, and other guerrilla events, and killing some of the, excuse me, as I remember, was British officers and the soldiers at that time, too. And it is easily possible that Pilate chose Barabbas, thinking that certainly the Jews would prefer Jesus to a murderer. Well, he was wrong. Not for every Jew, of course, but for some Jews stirred up by the chief priests, Pilate was wrong. I'm sure, I say I'm sure, I don't know, but my suspicion is that the chief priests reminded the people that this Barabbas was a freedom fighter. Did he? I don't know. We're not told. Here's a guess. Pilate is not going to be comfortable doing any of the following. Rendering a final verdict of innocence. Why not? Why wouldn't he be comfortable doing that? Because he didn't know what the Jewish mob that was being stirred up by the chief priests would do. So he might solve the Jesus problem, but he wouldn't solve the Jew problem. Matter of fact, he would exacerbate the Jewish problem. I notice how careful I was with that one. A final verdict of guilty would be a perversion of Roman justice. And you know, Pilate would have to think about how he could justify that rather than being a perversion, being the right decision. What if Caesar heard about it? That wouldn't sit well with Pilate, because he was not in Caesar's favorite chamber, chamber of favorites. No, Pilate was in trouble. He was not well thought of, apparently. But there's a third choice. Amnesty, assuming the people could be persuaded to ask for Jesus rather than asking for Barabbas. So that's the offer he's going to make. You want son of daddy, or you want son of God? Do you want the king of Israel, or do you want this guerrilla fighter? Remember, this crowd was brought together at Pilate's request. He seemingly intended to release Jesus in a public setting. That would have constituted Pilate's third such declaration, an attempt to release Jesus, as John told us earlier. So this is the third time that he's gone in front of them. Now he's got a problem, but he's going to try and barter Jesus against Barabbas to solve his dilemma and prevent a Jewish mob. Interestingly, Herod had agreed with Pilate's conclusion that Jesus was in fact innocent of anything calling for the death penalty under Roman law. I'm not sure where Herod went in terms of the Jewish law, but that was not the issue. The issue here is Roman law, since it is a Roman decision. Well, Pilate again declared an absence of evidence showing Jesus to be guilty. He was willing to punish him to satisfy the Jewish people and the mob, even though Roman law forbade punishing a prisoner who had not been yet found guilty. So He's even going out on the line there by flogging Jesus. If they said, no, we'll take Jesus, just flog him and give him to us. However, the chief priests, they were having anything of what Pilate was trying to do. They, of course, were under the orders, I'm sure, of Caiaphas, the head priest or top priest, or I forget the term now. It happens too. Instead, along the process, Pilate made the effort to release Jesus according to the Passover custom that the previous governors and he had been used to doing. So, let's see what happens. John 18:39, first half at least. But it is your custom that I release, and he said, it's the Jewish custom that I released as the governor, one prisoner for you at Passover. Mark 15:9 and 10. So, and this is Mark's take. So Pilate asked him, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. Notice it implies that Mark didn't say, or Judas, or Barabbas. He said, you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? But he knew the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. They did not like the popularity that Jesus was picking up, not knowing what they might lose in terms of influence and power. John 18:39, the second half of that verse in John, along with John 40, where Pilate is speaking. He said, John says, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? Again, didn't bring in Barabbas' name. Then they shouted back, not this man, but Son of Daddy. We want Son of Daddy. So the Jews were asking for the release of a guilty Son of Daddy instead of an innocent Son of God. The religious leaders normally had nothing to do with zealots, by the way. There is irony in their request. The religious leaders would have wanted to retain peaceful relationships with Rome. The zealots did not. They wanted independence from Rome. So, by releasing Barabbas, the Romans would release the one who was the threat to Rome that they were describing Jesus to be. And they would crucify Jesus, who was no such threat, while they would release the one who was guilty of the indictment against Jesus and impose that penalty on the innocent one. So that's how twisted this is going to be if Pilate caves. And of course we know he did. So, did Jesus die in Barabbas' place? You bet he did. Did Jesus die in your place? That depends upon your response to him, doesn't it? Clearly, the events we have just seen magnify the injustice by both the Jews and the Romans. The Jews instituted it and instigated it, but the Romans carried it out. Note again about the crowd. It's doubtful that there were many regular Jews present at this, 6 o'clock in the morning? It's even been speculated that the crowd present was paid to be there. Does that sound familiar? Like some of today's protests? Just as we in our time hear of groups being bussed in to protest one thing or another, In other words, they're not innocent bystanders. But there were chief priests leading and orchestrating all of these events. So this was a setup from the beginning. Pilate finally got the message that he will not overcome the chief priests' insistence, and their influence with the mob. He's not going to get rid of his Jewish problem by releasing Jesus. As a matter of fact, he's going to cause a Jewish problem if he releases Jesus. Meanwhile, the chief priests continually put in the fix. Mark 15:11, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas instead. When the offer was made, the chief priest says, "Son of Daddy." Luke 23:18, at least the last half part, says, they, the chief priests and the mob, all shouted out together, "Take this man away. Release Son of Daddy for us." Once again, Pilate offered to flog Jesus and then release him, as we saw just a moment ago. Consider this to be take two of Luke's offer. Luke 23:22. A third time, and there's this third time I've been talking about, he, Pilate, said to them, the crowd, "Why? What wrong has he done? I have found him guilty of no crime, deserving death. I will therefore flog him with light flogging and release him." Luke said this was Pilate's third attempt to free Jesus. The gospel narratives even allow for several more attempts, 4 or 5 attempts to free Jesus, but these 3 would be the main ones in this storyline. But it seems that Pilate underestimated the influence of the chief priest over the mob. Clearly, Roman legal rules indicate Pilate should have settled on a verdict of innocence and released Jesus without flogging. But after several unsuccessful attempts at pronouncing Jesus innocent, it says in Luke 23:23, but they, the chief priests in the crowd, were insistent, demanding with loud shouts that he, Jesus, Son of God, be crucified. Well, it seems that Pilate's about to waver in favor of the chief priests and the mob. You can see it coming. He can't hold out against this mob and what they might do forever. He's got to solve that problem. So we're going to continue next time seeing what actions Pilate will actually make. And there's an interesting statement by Paul as to Jesus' behavior in this matter. And I'm going to read 1 Timothy 6:13. I charge you, in the presence of God, who gives life to all things, and of Christ Jesus, listen to this, who testified the good confession before Pontius Pilate. Jesus said that Christ testified the good confession before Pilate. So, what do we assume as a consequence? Jesus' behavior remained above reproach and in keeping with Isaiah's description of the Messiah's behavior. In Isaiah 53:7, we've read it before. He, the Messiah, was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, which is not typical for a sheep, by the way. He would holler. So he, Messiah, did not open his mouth. Pilate ended up being used by the Jewish leaders in their drive to rid Israel of the Jewish problem as seen by the chief priests and the high priest. But a close examination shows that Pilate was a very unwilling and reluctant tool. He was weak, yes. He was vacillating, yes. He made mistakes, yes. But he did not want to release Jesus. We've seen that all the way through. What we learned is that the evil will of the Jewish leadership was stronger and more steadfast than Pilate's own will. Jesus had to die. Release, Son of Daddy, but crucify, Son of God. We'll see you next time with us, we hope.